Much has been written trying to classify players of various games to understand their playstyle habits. In 1996, Richard Bartle published a paper describing 4 primary player types common in MUDs, multi-user dungeons: killers, socializers, explorers, and achievers. Mark Rosewater of Magic the Gathering fame published an article in 2013 describing the terms Timmy, Johnny, and Spike, and later editions by fans included the spin-off archetypes Vorthos and Mel. Other classifications exist, but these are the 2 most commonly used and referred to player taxonomies in gaming. Fire Emblem has a series of 17 mainline games as of today, more if you include Divisions of Fates as separate, and every game has its own share of fans. No game is globally seen as a global improvement over any other by every member of the community, as they all have elements that even their remakes don't fully capture in the same way. Today, I am going to use player taxonomy as shorthand for the types of engagement every main series Fire Emblem game provides to try and explain why different people enjoy these different games, and maybe as an applicable metric for you to see if you may or may not enjoy a particular Fire Emblem game. After debating for a while, I decided to just focus on the MTG 5 classifications for this video. The Bartle types are valid, but are too steeped specifically in multiplayer online gameplay and functionality to effectively separate them out without stepping on toes. While the Rosewater taxonomy was initially created for Magic the Gathering, there does tend to be enough broad applicability of the 5 types to give reasonable coverage to other games, though I will add personal caveats and addendums as needed to more fully address the various aspects of enjoyment or frustration within any given Fire Emblem game specifically. So, what are the 5 player types that I will be using? They represent the primary factors of engagement between players and games. While most players identify as a mixture of several types, and there are some that aren't included, there tend to be 1 or 2 that every player most strongly identifies with. I will first go over the archetypes, then some examples of blending every paired combination, leaving 3+ combos and the like for you to suss out yourself. Bear in mind that these are not my naming conventions, they're established names created by other sources. You may have heard different names for these archetypes, these are just the ones I'm most familiar with. Timmy, sometimes Tammy, is the widest and least effectively defined archetype. Often described as playing for fun, or for spectacle or unique experiences, Timmys tend to get cast as liking big monsters or huge explosive effects or one-and-done solutions. Rule of cool is important for a Timmy, as is impact. Timmys often like doing things their way, or the underdog story of come-from-behind victories, but that won't stop them from looking up guides if it gets them to the result they want. In Fire Emblem terms, a Timmy might pick a favorite unit and give them every stat booster solely because it's their favorite, regardless of if it's meta or not. Johnny, sometimes Jenny or Jane, is the lover of complex interactions. The combo deck architect, the theory crafter, the optimizer, Johnny plays to express their knowledge of the game pieces and interactions, particularly around niche or narrow use cases. Why win in a simple way when you can assemble a full Rube Goldberg machine and make a totally unheard of setup to cross the finish line? It doesn't matter how many attempts it takes, so long as it happens eventually. Johnnies may look up guides for information or inspiration, but love to create things out of their own. In Fire Emblem terms, a Johnny's favorite part of the game might be in creating their own builds, skill combos, or child units, and playing the rest of the game just as a setup machine to make their dream team work. Spike, no gendered equivalent found, likes to win. Spike also likes to prove they won. They embrace unfair or unfun techniques and strategies because their enjoyment comes not from the journey, but from the finish line. Doesn't matter how expensive, how bland, how painful, how confusing the method, for a true Spike, being the best would be all that matters. In Fire Emblem terms, a Spike might be the first to optimize the fun out of the game, because it's the optimization itself, not the game, that's their version of fun. These 3 player archetypes were defined as ways in which players engage with a game on both a gameplay and marketing level. The final 2 break this mold somewhat, as they don't necessarily involve gameplay in their engagement loop. Vorthos is the name given to players who interact primarily with lore and aesthetics. They read books, memorize names, and care very deeply about the fiction around the gameplay. They also like things to match together. They might care deeply about a particular look or theme, and might get very upset if it gets changed. They may not interact with a game that otherwise has everything they want, purely on the basis that it looks or sounds unappealing to them, but they might play something that they otherwise hate just because it has the right aesthetics. In Fire Emblem terms, a Vorthos main might prefer to use Empress LaguzGuard for its aesthetic, and because it's her unique class, more than for any gameplay reason. Mel is perhaps the most confusing and misunderstood archetype. Often mistaken for a Johnny, Mel doesn't actually care about creating complex combos or crafting unique expressions of gameplay. Mel just wants to know how everything works. A Mel is often more engaged by a game that uses its basic pieces in interesting ways than a game that has many complex modifiers to change how every piece functions. While Johnny may be interested in the edge cases, and Timmy cares about the big finish, Mel cares about the basic building blocks that make up the bulk of the game. In Fire Emblem terms, Mel might be, for instance, the person that finds the subtle differences between Christmas Cavaliers incredibly interesting. With the 5 big archetypes on the table, let's quickly go over some combo taxonomy like I promised before we get back to Fire Emblem. Timmy/Johnny loves unique builds that have big interactions, particularly lets them use their favorite ability or unit. Playing with the end result is just as important as imagining it, like coming up with the Paradox Black Mage meme rotation in Final Fantasy XIV. Timmy/Spike plays to win and loves to win, but wants to win with a big finish. They want to be the person who wins the Pokemon VGC with a Pachirisu on their team because it makes them stand out. Timmy Vorthos loves playing with their favorite characters, getting into the fiction and identifying strongly with a particular faction. They're orc players in Warhammer 40k that fully embrace their chosen clan and refuse to play anything else, even when it isn't meta. Timmy Mel has a ton of fun breaking down the pieces of why their favorite unit, ability, or mechanic works, like that friend who wants to share and explain their favorite board game with anyone who will listen. Johnny Spike wants to win with unfair combos and complex interactions. They're the first person to discover a one-turn kill, and are most likely to be the one playing an absurd win condition combo like the old pole position infinite loop lock in Yu-Gi-Oh! Johnny Vorthos wants to embody the archetype with the most absurd and creative uses of their tools, while still staying true to in character or being lore accurate. They might come up with a unique combo character build in D&D, along with all the backstory to make it make sense in-universe. Johnny Mel becomes the true encyclopedia, the person who knows every detail about every interaction in the game, and is more than happy to explain in excruciating detail how and why it all works that way, like that card game judge that really enjoys making complicated game state calls. Spike Vorthos wants to win while identifying with their particular faction. If there's not a meta way to play what they like, they might just not play until their faction is back on top. Spike Mel wants to win by understanding the core fundamentals of the game better than their opponent. Rules lawyers are the more hated version of a Spike Mel, while expert players who grow on to teach others are the more beloved. Vorthos Mel cares deeply about how things look, feel, and interact on a very basic level. These are the D&D players that want to know the biological mechanics of Dragon Breath, who care about the mechanical impact of encumbrance and fatigue, and who refuse to overlook inconvenient rules for the sake of having a more realistic and functional simulation. When it comes to Fire Emblem, these player archetypes still need a bit more finagling to fit within the useful shell of context, so I'm going to extract them as follows. Timmy represents unique or standout things you can do. Good units who are good, bad units who can be made good, unique experiences, and the likelihood that your run will look and feel differently compared to someone else's are all areas that I am placing value on for the Timmy score of a game. Johnny represents complexity and customization. The more skills and classes a game has, the more unique or customized you can make your army, and the more complexity there is in playing a game, the higher the Johnny score will be. Spike is difficult for single-player games, but I'm going to use Spike as a rating of potential difficulty, built-in challenge potential, and tools for skill differentiation. If a game has particularly hard difficulty settings, or can be optimized beyond recognition for casual players, then it will likely have a higher Spike rating. Vorthos is about 2 things, story and aesthetics. If a game has a great aesthetic and an engaging story, it will likely be higher on Vorthos' score. If a game lacks non-gameplay engagement or consistency in its aesthetic, while the FE community might term unit feel, then it will probably have a lower Vorthos score. Mel is less about finding combos or complexity like Johnny, and more about truly understanding and engaging with their mechanics at play. As such, if a game has mechanics that function well, can be understood, and are interesting to piece out and analyze, then it will get a higher Mel score. A better Mel score will also be given to games that mine the depth of their mechanics well, such as through map objectives requiring deeper understanding of movement tech, or of combat encounters that ask for better understanding of the core unit matchups. A lower Mel score will be given to games that have confusing or nonsensical mechanics, fail to utilize their mechanics in meaningful ways, or can be solved more effectively by ignoring the core mechanics of the game rather than by engaging with them. So with all that out of the way, let's talk Fire Emblem. Fire Emblem 1 is a history piece. It is a fascination for players who want to experience how the series began for themselves. It's slow, simple, and at times obtuse or vague because of how little information is directly given to the player, but it's fairly easy if you know how to play. Most characters only talk when joining, and barely get a portrait and blurb at the end. In today's day and age, and in comparison with the rest of the series, there's not a lot of Timmy, Johnny, or Spike going on, although some Spikes might like optimizing warp uses. Vorthos may be happy with the narrative and aesthetic consistency, but will likely be better suited by FE3. There is still some charm here for Mel's, however, who may find the unique initial implementation of the series' core mechanics, from XP calculation to level upgrades to the various glitches and idiosyncrasies, rather charming. If you're a series historian, or the type of person who likes digging into old RPGs to figure out how the heck they got it to work, you might be able to enjoy yourself with FE1. Fire Emblem 2 Gaiden is all about its open world map, dungeons, villagers with multiple class options, multiple tiers of unit promotions, and equipment without durability that has some very powerful effects. Gaiden has some powerful moments and very strong characters and items that can appeal to Timmy, and the customization of villagers and finding use cases for various spell lists and more unique items can appeal to Johnny somewhat. It's still quite easy with limited forms of skill expression outside of challenges, leaving most Spikes neutral at best. Vorthos again depends on if they like the aesthetic of the Famicom, and Mel is an odd case here, as there is more Johnny overlap with cool spells and items than unique mechanic-side intrigue like FE1, though understanding its peculiarities can still be quite rewarding. Many people will claim that with Shadows of Valentia out there is no reason to play the original Gaiden, but I couldn't disagree with that statement more. Maybe it's just the old Famicom jank that interests me, or maybe it's the fact that the most powerful tools of Gaiden were nerfed into the ground in the SOV, but the particular idiosyncrasies of Gaiden do make it worth playing as its own novel and unique experience, in my opinion. A remake of Fire Emblem 1 with the entire sequel story packed in, leaving a few missions and characters out in the process, Mystery of the Emblem's extra user-friendliness and giving more information, as well as more flashiness in things like how Manicheets work and the introduction of dancers, makes it a bit better for all player types over Fire Emblem 1 in my opinion, outside of the historical appreciators of Famicom-era jank. The extra realism of things like dismounting grants additional potential appeal to Vorthos, and the underlying mechanics reward Mel as well, even if other players might dislike the feature. I'm not sure what else to say about Fire Emblem 3 aside from these rankings might be casting it in a bad light. I genuinely enjoy this game, and for anyone else interested in a version of FE1 with a bit more accessibility but without the reclassing or potentially off-putting aesthetic of the DS remake, Fire Emblem 3 is definitely worth playing on its own. Genealogy's rankings are going to be quite high. Despite a lot of mixed opinions on the actual execution of the game or specific mechanics, there is something here for almost every player. The sheer power and magnificence of holy weapons in the hands of Holy Blood units in FE4 is one of the biggest power trips that Fire Emblem has to offer, and I can't think of any Fire Emblem loving Timmy that isn't at least potentially excited by that concept. Johnny gets to play with all the craziness of the inheritance system and plan their Gen 2 builds, and Spike has plenty to optimize with these builds as well as playing for rankings. Vorthos has a rich story with international politics to engage with, and of course Mel can dive into the specifics of lever points, gold management, inheritance, various glitches, and all of that. Something for everyone. Of course, just because you have something for everyone does not mean everyone will like your game, as some mechanics that appeal to one player can be quite unappealing to another. For instance, while Johnny and Spike players might really enjoy making different unit pairings, a Vorthos player might be unhappy with the idea of breaking the canon established in Thracia by, for example, creating a world in which Ced does not inherit Forseti, or doesn't even exist. The mechanics that a Mel might love to tinker with could be off-putting to Timmy, or the high power of certain preset units like Shannon or Ares might upset a Johnny who wants their homebrew child unit to be the most powerful. And that's not even getting into the hidden events, some of which provide very useful unique items that I think risk rubbing most player archetypes the wrong way. In short, while I highly recommend playing FE4 to find something you love, I can't guarantee you won't also find something you hate about it. Perhaps one of the stranger rankings, Thracia does a lot of really cool things for almost every player archetype. A great story, aesthetic, and scale for Vorthos, some unique mechanics like FCC or stamina for Mel, a high level of complexity with customization via scroll and item management for Johnny, and a number of challenging maps for Spike. But the Timmy appeal does end up suffering quite a bit, brought up only by the fact that Thracia's unique mechanics allows for some potentially insane results with things like movement growths. Again, like with Genealogy, the conflicting design decisions that some players really latch onto can bother others to no end. For example, if you like consistency in your planning and play, then movement stars and highly unlikely movement and build growths can be off-putting. If you want to create broken skill combinations, then you might be disappointed to learn that things like Wrath and Vantage might not work together like they do in later games. Thracia is ultimately a game that is more complex than outright challenging, which can make it seem incredibly unfair to the uninformed player, but deeply satisfying for someone who knows what to expect and how to overcome it all. It's simple, it's questionably fan-translated, and is perhaps one of the most remade Fire Emblem games by fans. The Binding Blade is the game that I wanted to talk about when creating this video. A lot of Fire Emblem players don't like this game because a lot of them fall into the traditional Johnny camp, and the more bare-bones nature of FE6 lacks much of that appeal for them. A cast full of a mix of relative nobodies with a handful of godlike units is also a hard sell to many Timmies, who might be frustrated that they can't make their particular favorite unit as good as the big three of Rutger, Milady, or Percival. Spike is an odd one here, as there are plenty of ways to use the tools at your disposal to optimize the game, and plenty of benefits for doing so, including rankings, but the overall amount you can optimize as well as the way the difficulty is implemented is lesser compared to later entries. Vorthos is likely to be fairly unimpressed by its simple story, and while some of the most powerful units like Milady or Percival make sense to be powerful due to their history and military backgrounds, others lack the close tie-in between the gameplay presence and their fictionally positioned power like Cecilia or Douglas. Mel is at an odd point as well, because despite the game not having as many complex mechanics to make use of, it does do a good job at reinforcing the importance of every core mechanic available to you, particularly on hard mode. A lot of people don't seem to jive with FE6. That said, for the people for whom FE6 works, it does work very well, so if you think you might be that particular type of player, give it a shot. Considered by many to be the most standard Fire Emblem 7 has a decently sized cast of mostly viable characters, with some standout Timmy moments from Lynn's first crit against Bat of the Beast, to the Hectorcopter Armads, or Canos's Luna crit on the final boss, combined with a compelling character-driven story that might be simple and have its issues, but still manages to capture most players for their first time through. Johnnies probably have the least to say about this game, as no skills, reclassing, or promotion trees means your biggest choice moments are who you're training. Spikes have rankings to fight for, as well as several interesting choices on how to optimize challenges like LTC or Draft. Vorthos might be the ones to poke holes in FE7's story, or complain about the issues it causes for FE6, but they might also enjoy the genuinely interesting and enjoyable character writing, particularly in the sports. Mel is a big mixed bag once again, but I rate it slightly lower for FE7 compared to FE6, due to FE7 not really requiring as much understanding of the core mechanics as FE6 in order to progress well. If you've played or heard of Fire Emblem, you are probably familiar with FE7. If you somehow are not, do yourself a favor and at least try it out for yourself. It was the Western world's first Fire Emblem, and there's a reason that it took off so well, even if it hasn't stayed number one in the hearts of all players once nostalgia's faded and they found more games fitting their particular game style more. Fire Emblem 8 is a Fire Emblem game about power tripping, without the need for complicated skills or overpowered combos. Seth himself is a standout for this, but most of the cast can be made into ideal soldiers, doubly so with the access to free grinding, making this a great Timmy game. Slightly more customization in the form of branching promotions makes FE8 a bit more palatable for true Johnnies than its GBA predecessors. Spike loses out pretty big here though, with no rankings to compete for and only self-imposed challenges to provide a speed bump for difficulty. Vorthos may find the overall story fairly simple and the main characters a bit bland, but the dark and creepy without being edgy aesthetic and the number of memorable story moments and supports may be attractive for them. Mel has a decent amount to dig into here, between analyzing best choices for split promotions and analyzing the relative return on investment for various units, but nothing outstanding or unique above what Fire Emblem 7 offers. If any of this sounds interesting, give FE8 a look. It is the most polished mechanically of the GBA trio, and represents in many ways an evolutionary midpoint between Gaiden and Awakening. Path of Radiance is the Vorthos game. Everything fits its consistent aesthetic, character death invokes script changes, and it places a lot more focus on how it builds its world through its story than any other Fire Emblem game. Mel has a lot to love too, with unique mechanics like Laguz gauges, shove, bonus objectives providing bonus EXP, and more. Timmy has a ton of cool characters to enjoy, and ways to make any of them godlike between BAXP and Forges. Johnny has a bit less complexity to latch onto than the other games, but the skill and Forge systems both provide some elements of buildcraft. Spike has some bonus objectives to brag about, and a ton of optimization between shove strats, high reward builds, and the like, though this is tempered somewhat by the ease of dumping all your resources into one unit and letting them dominate the game. The world building, aesthetic, and core mechanics are ultimately the big reasons to play Path of Radiance, more so than the difficulty, buildcraft, or replay value. It is definitely worth playing if any of that interests you, if only to make up your own opinions about the game. Radiant Dawn features a ton of strong characters, resources to make them even better, and cool things for those characters to do, plus a split-act structure which gives the majority of the cast the opportunity to see use and prove their worth, which is good for Timmy. Johnny will appreciate the ability to take skills off of units and put them onto others, even personal skills, which Path of Radiance lacked. Spike has a lot more optimization to manage between multiple armies, hidden items everywhere to find, and a number of inventive strategies to absolutely crush otherwise challenging chapters. Vorthos takes a slight hit down from Path of Radiance though, as the excellent world building of POR takes a few hits in service to building a continental scale conflict, which does introduce some inconsistencies and questionable plot contrivance in an otherwise excellent story, though the aesthetic consistency is still once again top tier. The biggest winner of this game, however, is Mel, with a full suite of mechanics that all fold back into the core gameplay, from ledges to height advantage to bonus objectives, to the decisions involved in split act structure, character recruitment party changes, and more. I rate Mel particularly high for these mechanics above later ones because they all build off of the core Fire Emblem gameplay instead of feeling like they're stapled on top, as will be discussed with later games. Radiant Dawn really is better if you've played Path of Radiance already in terms of appreciating how Path of Radiance sets everything up, not just world and story and characters, but also in mechanical growth and how Radiant Dawn expands upon everything POR started. Its sheer length may be off-putting to some, but there is a ton of game here to take apart and play with. A game that struggles to appeal to Timmy and Vorthos is an interesting concept, but Shadow Dragon DS is one. You have some cool things to do, and unique units like the Ballisticians and the absolute growth beasts of Wolf and Sedgar, but beyond that, there's not really a whole lot initially exciting about this game, and in fact, the very presence of literal filler units and death guidance can be off-putting to many Timmies. And as for Vorthos, the combination of oft-considered bland, clay-like 3D unit models with few distinguishing characteristics, as well as a reclassing system that can completely change how units look and function, can be very off-putting for them. That's about where the bad news for Shadow Dragon DS ends for the rankings though. With more play, the amount of options and routes throughout the game increases, particularly in the realm of optimizing uses of infinite warp range, expensive forges, and the like. The high difficulty of H5 in particular is one of the more uniquely appealing features of Shadow Dragon, as it seems to tread the line of difficult but fair quite well, considering the multitude of ways that a player can use their limited tools in creative ways to find victory. Shadow Dragon is definitely a game that I would recommend to veteran players looking to improve their core mechanics. I used to hate this game, but the more Fire Emblem I play, the greater appreciation I have for it being unashamedly what it is. And perhaps a more extreme case, New Mystery has the same issues and benefits of Shadow Dragon DS turned up to the max. The cast is so big as to be entirely forgettable, the customization fails to provide unique toys to play with, especially with the removal of Ballisticians, and while the unit models have some more unique palettes, they still fail to truly stand out. That said, New Mystery is the biggest test of your understanding of the core mechanics of Fire Emblem in the series, especially at high difficulty levels. Stat benchmarks, AI behavior, weapon forging, EXP management, and more will be tested for players going through this game, making it the premier Spike Mel game of the series. I don't have much more to say about New Mystery. It is what it is, unashamedly and without fluff or facade. You'll either love it, be fascinated by it, or won't be able to stand it. And that's all without even mentioning the Timmy Johnny timeline starts now. Memorable units, highly customizable skill builds, limited options in reclassing but nearly limitless options in child builds, Awakening focuses on giving Theory Emblem players what they want, and it works well for them. Spike has some accomplishment chasing to do between Lunatic Plus and the post-game difficulty DLC no longer available, and there are some unique interactions with skills and pair-ups that Mels can grab onto. Vorthos will be a mixed bag though, as they will either love the aesthetic and the time-traveling story, or be off-put by it entirely. The implications of certain paralogs or lack of apparent consistency between certain story elements may also be enough to bother them, though because every individual is different, I cannot say for sure. Awakening was an incredibly popular game, and starting point for many fans of the series, and it's easy to see why, though it's also easy to see why it has caught the disdain of many who see other games in the series as the true pinnacle of what Awakening was trying to create. The first F on the board and the only truly unrateable score as well, welcome to Fate's Birthright. It's a great Timmy and decent Johnny game, whether you love seeing Ryoma shred through North right into in a dream, or whether you like making your other units have fun and creative builds. But between infinitely available EXP and gold, a lack of particularly difficult enemies even on Lunatic, and not really needing to train many units to optimize the game, Birthright has the lowest spike rating probably of the whole series. Mel has some things to latch onto between the new pair-up stance mechanics and the new weapons and classes, and Vorthos is one that I honestly can't rate here, because a lot of players enjoy Birthright solely for the Eastern Japanese-inspired aesthetic, but many other big aesthetic heads dislike it solely for that reason, preferring the Western fantasy aesthetic of much of the rest of the series. Story-wise, it is a mixed bag, though I also cannot comment on Fates' story without waking the hive of localization blamers from their hibernation, so I will merely leave this as unrated. I personally find Birthright forgettable and uninspiring, but if something about the game speaks to you, then who am I to say you shouldn't play it and enjoy it? Fire Emblem's openly stated attempt to appeal more directly to the hardcore players, Conquest did certainly deliver on that in many ways, focusing on powering up enemies through a combination of stats and skills, and then using the Dragon Vein mechanic to create unique set-piece encounters was a decision that in many ways worked out well with the more hardcore player base, as it wore the community-given moniker of best gameplay in the series for years, until players began to rediscover the joy of simplicity. The peak of what many players refer to as Skill Emblem, Conquest appeals to Johnny Spike in its reliance upon the player to find or create the tools needed to overcome its challenges, rather than providing them directly. The plot is mostly used as an abstraction to string together the interesting set-piece encounters, and has been widely ridiculed for reasons that I don't need to repeat here, as this is not a full review. But suffice it to say that aesthetic alone carries Vorthos, and even that is a hodgepodge of callbacks, sleek design, and wild outliers. If you like Conquest, I'm happy for you. I know there's a large community that does. I'm not one of you, so I will fully admit my bias will make it difficult for me to recommend it for accurate reasons, so feel free to get in the comments to help tell people why they should give Conquest a shot. Can you even obtain and play Revelations anymore? Not that that's stopping me, I'm just going to assume you have your ways and means just like with all other Fire Emblem games. Moving right along, Revelations doubles down on map gimmicks and main character importance. You can eventually get almost every character in the game, except for 3, 2 of which are present only temporarily, and because of this, it has what's considered one of the biggest sandbox playgrounds for army compositions in the series. Crazy skill builds, monotype armies, wild pairings, it's all here! Story and aesthetic are not the focus of Revelations. Sorry, Vorthos, all you get is a golden route ending to put questions to any potential earlier canon. Meanwhile, all the mechanics are the same as the other Fates entries, though enemy skills are generally closer to Birthright than to Conquest, with maps leaning into unique gimmicks well beyond what Conquest provides. Ultimately, Rev is a sandbox, a goofy, strange, horribly balanced sandbox. If that sounds like a fun trip, get on it. If not, then that's really all you're missing. Shadows of Valentia is a remake of Gaiden with all the glory and baggage that carries. It also carries experimental elements like 3D dungeon exploration, transformational weapon forging trees instead of just stat increases, and combat arts. Timmys have some powerful toys to play with, but few things as innately broken as their Gaiden counterparts outside of the brand new killer bow. Johnnies have some reclassing options on top of weapon trees and spell lists, though it's definitely less free or complex than other games. Spike has some ways to optimize resources, a post-game challenge dungeon in Thebes, and achievements to get via the medal system, but most gameplay ends up being fairly simple even on hard, without the massive difficulty modes of other games. Vorthos has the strongest pull to this game, with a beautiful and fairly unique aesthetic, combined with fairly simple and mostly well-told story, with dynamic reactions to unit deaths baked into the entire script, not just at the end or the beginning. It's commonly said that the presentation of SOV carries the entire game. Mel, on the other hand, has not much more to latch onto over Gaiden. While I firmly believe both Gaiden and SOV are worth playing for their own reasons, if you had to only pick one game to play to experience the Almond Celica story, make it SOV. How do I talk about Three Houses without sounding like both a shill and a hater at the same time? I'm not the biggest fan of this game in retrospect, but I still thoroughly enjoyed playing all the routes and the DLC story and can appreciate what the game is. Three Houses is unapologetically the Johnny game. Every unit is fully customizable, with their own unique skills, spells, and arts to discover. The game was built around a small, entirely customizable roster, with only the recruitable faculty members starting deep into a particular class line. The feeling of growing units from zero to hero, and the sheer power of some of the broken builds you can make, also speak strongly to Timmy players, and even Spikes can appreciate just how broken all of the complex interlocking systems can be, with the very high apparent difficulty of maddening mode being both a near insurmountable challenge for the unprepared, and a hilariously broken and solved run even under some of the most absurd self-imposed challenges. The story varies in quality and delivery between routes, and might not be a fully satisfying experience when playing all routes, but to a new player, the experience is very solid and immersive. reclassing is handled in at least a more lore-grounded way, and the aesthetics of the world are bold and consistent, so overall there's a lot for Vorthos to latch onto. Mel is a weird one. In a vacuum, there are a lot of different mechanics, which seems like it should be good for Mel. However, many of those mechanics either self-contained or stapled onto the core FE gameplay instead of truly working together with the core mechanics. For instance, battalions and class tutoring provide extra options and reinforce customization, but are additions that can, in many cases, be transferred to other units. Unique spell and art lists sound good, but end up transforming the game into caring only about what spells, arts, and skills a unit can get, far more than their core stats. Playing Three Houses, especially with its most powerful builds and abilities, often feels unrecognizable compared to the core gameplay of the rest of the series. These scores, in a vacuum, make Three Houses look quite good, and overall it is. I didn't cover many of its structural issues, TDM or other annoyances, but most of those only come out on subsequent playthroughs. If you've never tried Three Houses, it is definitely worth at least trying, and there are many reasons why the game became a bestseller for the series. Just be aware that the game is very different from the rest of the series, for better or for worse, and the optimizing community is absolutely rampant with Three Houses compared to most other games outside of maybe Conquest. Engage is a strong Timmy game, with emblem abilities providing a lot of cool things you can do, and the combination of emblem and bond rings, with fairly open reclassing, gives Johnny some decent play as well. Spike has some competitive multiplayer options, which are almost entirely unused, and a high difficulty option in Maddening that challenges your ability to use both your emblems and the strengths of your units. Vorthos hates a lot of this game. The character designs are all unique, but they don't really feel like they exist in the same world. The story is a mess of tropes from across the series executed to varying degrees of success. That's not to say there's nothing of value in the story or aesthetic, but Vorthos in particular identifies with interconnectedness of everything, and the sporadic nature of Engage tends to be ill-suited to that form of enjoyment. Mel has deeper issues with Engage, despite also having some genuinely enjoyable things to love. The core mechanics aren't too hard to understand, and much of the game does revolve around that core, but at times it feels like you're playing two different games layered on top of each other between the units and the emblems, with only middling connections between the two. A number of tacked-on gameplay elements in the Somniel also serve only to distract from the core gameplay, and when they do interact, it's either minor or random. Later additions like the DLC and the Well end up magnifying Mel's problems by turning the ideal methods of buildcraft away from strategic gameplay and towards randomness. The general lack of distinct unit identity, combined with an overall simplification of maps and the very few meaningful side objectives, means Engage only asks the player to solve the puzzle of overcome the enemy units in front of the player. I'm realizing I ranted a lot in this section, so I guess I just totally outed myself as a Mel, but in writing this section, I wanted you to know the Mel score started at B and steadily fell all the way to D. As a whole, Engage is a weird game to rate or recommend. It honestly feels like a game that had a lot of cool ideas, but had no real vision on how they fit together or on what type of game it wanted to be. Casual Three Houses fans claim that it abandoned social simulation in favor of doubling down on strategy, but then even the strategic gameplay feels fractured at its core. I did genuinely enjoy this game when it came out, but the more you analyze it and think about it, the more you realize how deep its flaws run. It is a great game to play blind and enjoy for the crazy wild ride it is, both in gameplay and in story, but it really doesn't feel built for more than that. This video ballooned on me rapidly, going from a quick follow-up to one of the longest scripts that I've ever written, and taking multiple weeks to make. I guess at the end of the day, my takeaway is that because different people will genuinely enjoy different games for different reasons, there's not any strictly correct design decisions that'll appeal to everyone. It's probably a fool's errand to try to classify games like this, and to be prescriptive for enjoyment, especially when, even within taxonomic groups, players will value different aspects of gameplay differently. My personal definition of Mel, for instance, leans more into unit simplicity and map complexity, but someone else's definition might be just the opposite, and that doesn't necessarily mean either of us are wrong. At the end of the day, just enjoy things. Don't spend all your time hating on something someone else likes, because that opinion isn't universal. And even if you see major issues that are total deal breakers for you, someone else might not care, but they might actually like the very thing you hate for those exact same reasons. A link to some resources that I found useful in making this video can be found in the description below. There are some Kodak videos talking about the card game player archetypes, a Tim Kane video on the Bartle types, as well as the initial Rosewater article and a source for Bartle's paper. As always, a massive thank you to Royal LaguzGuard member Sal Mellon, and LaguzGuard members C2 Piccoli, Enigmatic Mr. L, The Big Herman 007, Bro Juderman, NKO Rico, Kumi, Miss Mesmerism, Lakag, and Relaz6 for supporting the channel directly. You can support as well for less than $1 a month, while gaining access to perks like early video access and members-only gameplay and Q&A vids. And until next time, this is Mithril Zenith signing out.